All right, welcome to today's Work from Home Wednesday webinar. Today's topic is managing conflict remotely and managing conflict in remote teams. I'm your host, Dave Collins, and we're gonna go ahead and jump right into the content. Today's workshop is sponsored and presented by Oak and Reeds. That's my company. That's who is bringing you the content today. We do a variety of interactive training topics. If you've come to any of our webinars previously, you'll note that we deliver content on a lot of topics related to remote work, related to dealing with change, related to communicating both in person and remotely. All of our trainings are interactive, just like these webinars. And all of our trainings are designed both for in-person, whenever we can do that again, and specifically for remote audiences. We've tweaked a lot of our content to make sure that we are engaging people through the medium. That is kind of exactly the medium that we are going to be dealing with today, which is remote communication, remote conflict. We work with a lot of different companies. You may be on one of these companies, working at one of these companies right now. If you're on this webinar, I see some folks who I recognize as well. We work in a variety of industries. So again, this content is free, but also an opportunity for you to see how we operate. And if this is something that's interesting for you and interesting for your colleagues, let us know. We'd love to bring a workshop to your team. Now, today we're here for a variety of reasons. And I do want to start this workshop both by kind of taking a step back and acknowledging that we're talking about conflict in a moment in the United States when we're all witnessing an incredibly important set of conflicts happening across the country. I think it goes hopefully without saying, but I'm going to say it right now that myself, this company, we fully support what's happening in terms of what these protests are about. We're going to talk about conflict today. And when it comes to violence and police violence, it's a situation that is a cycle. And what we're going to look at in this workshop today, not to tie it too tightly to the world, we're going to look at cycles of conflict. And I think what we're noticing right now is a cycle of conflict in our country that keeps repeating. And so with that, I'll keep my statement short. We're putting in a link to show how we're supporting this situation, which is a community bail fund donation. I've donated. I would encourage all of you to donate. I think it's really important to show support, and I think it's really important that we engage. And in my small way today, I hope what we're learning about conflict and these ideas, and it's going to be very clear what I mean by that in a moment. I think these ideas are incredibly important to understand sources of conflict and ways to analyze and resolve conflict in meaningful ways and not just pay lip service to them. So with that, it's an awkward transition, but let's get into what we're here to talk about today, which is remote conflict in teams. And we're going to start with a tool called the Thomas-Kilmann model for conflict. And we're going to start by looking at ways that you can identify styles of conflict that you can use. And more importantly, how you can look at a conflict situation, ask yourself some critical questions to get more information about what's going on so you can choose an appropriate response that fits the facts and fits the situation. We're going to talk about why that's more important than using your own personal preferences. It's better to think about what does this situation call for and what are the strategies I can use. Then I'm going to get into this cycle of collaborative conflict and what we can do to break out of a conflict to solve something more effectively. And finally, I'm going to end with a look at some of the complexities that arise when we're trying to resolve conflict remotely. A lot of our go-to situations and a lot of our go-to tools for resolving conflict most efficiently and effectively often require an in-person meeting and in-person communication for all the various reasons I've been talking about over these last 10 weeks around why remote conflict is difficult. I'm going to look at what we're missing when we try to do things remotely and some simple steps you can take to try to upskill yourself and hopefully resolve some of these remote conflicts before they start, and what you can do if you start to notice situations arising with your remote teams that you can use some remote tools to resolve conflicts effectively. And again, if you have questions throughout, I'm going to be moving pretty quickly. This recording will be available afterwards, and I'll also spend as much time as we want answering questions in the Q&A box at the end of this workshop. All right, so let's go ahead and jump right in. First thing I want to talk about are what are called the Thomas-Kilmann modes of conflict. So Thomas and Kilmann were two operations researchers who looked at conflict in organizations. And what they came up with through their research is essentially they learned a couple things. One, people in complex organizations, large businesses, are really bad at assessing their own conflict preferences and their own styles. So by that, I mean, people say they approach conflict in a certain way, but then in observation, they actually do it wildly differently and with a much lower degree of effectiveness than they believe, which again, not to say that's good or bad, but it's probably something we've experienced as well. What they also found, and probably more importantly for us today, is they found that conflict in organizations can kind of be boiled down into one of 5 modes or one of 5 approaches. And what we're going to use today are these modes as a way to simplify our choices when it comes to addressing a conflict in a remote team. So the way they describe these modes of conflict that you can choose from are essentially across 2 variables. And it's how you as an individual are approaching a conflict. So how cooperative are you being, which is essentially how much do you care about satisfying the other person's needs, versus assertiveness. That's how much do you care about satisfying your own needs or your own interests. Every conflict style, they argue, has some degree of both, whether it's high in both, low in both, or some combination. Now, it's an oversimplification, but I think it's a really useful way to think about different ways that you can approach a situation where you're at odds with someone. So the first style is avoiding, right? That's low in both assertiveness and cooperativeness. When you avoid a conflict, you're not trying to get what you want out of the situation, and you're also not taking care of the other person. You're basically trying to ignore the conflict and essentially avoid dealing with it. So it's low in both. Now, there are times and places for avoiding conflict, such as when tensions are really high and there's not necessarily the tools to solve it at hand, but maybe they will be coming shortly. So it makes sense to delay and then engaging later on. But typically you don't want to avoid conflict if ultimately you are the only person who can solve this conflict. That's simply procrastinating. The next style is accommodating, right? So that's, if we move all the way down to the cooperativeness, you're high in cooperativeness, low in assertiveness. What that means is you're taking care of the other person more than you're taking care of yourself, right? So you're deferring to authority. Maybe a person in a higher level of leadership wants you to do something. You disagree, but you realize that fighting that battle may not be worth it and you may not win. So that's a critical thing. If you know you're not going to win, it may make sense to accommodate, especially if you know you're going to have more asks of this person later on. This is a pick your battles type approach. Competing is the opposite, right? That's high in assertiveness, low in cooperativeness. You're using every available means at your disposal to get what you want, and you care very little or not at all about satisfying the other person's needs. Think of this as zero sum, win at all costs. Very useful, especially if there's something where you know you're right and people could be hurt or the business could be affected if you get this wrong. So you really want to make sure to fight sort of a justifiable or noble fight. It may be worth stepping on toes to do the right thing. Competition, not useful if you know you're going to lose, right? Because you're just battling something where it'll be very difficult and ultimately the forces arrayed against you are not going to allow that to happen. So big power imbalances can be a tough moment for competition. Compromise is in the middle, right? Kind of makes sense. You're taking care of yourself to a certain degree, and you're also taking care of the other person to a certain degree. Now, it's not all the way, so both sides have to give a little bit, and that's why often compromise gets derided in business publications where you're kind of, it's a lose-lose, right? So there is an element of that where you don't want to compromise on critical areas like your business, like your personal values, or on areas that are critical to the business, but compromise can be really useful when you need a short-term solution to something quickly, especially if you know a better solution is coming down the line and you don't want to spend a lot of time hashing something out. And of having this midway quick compromise, very useful. Finally, collaborating is the gold standard. It's Cadillac, although I'm not sure Cadillac would be the #1 car anymore, but collaborating is high in both. I'm going to talk about collaboration more, but the critical thing you want to look at with collaboration is you're taking care of both people's needs to the maximum. In order to do that, it actually takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of listening, takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of effort. You also, of all the conflict modes, collaboration is the one that actually requires both people to agree to a process. You can't have one person trying to collaborate, one person trying to compete. It's not going to work. And so because of that, it's important to really pick and choose the moments you do collaborative conflict, because you want to use it in situations where this is a person you're going to be working with a lot, and it's worth taking the time to build the relationship and solve a problem in this way. I'll talk about the steps to that. It's the best. It's also the most time intensive, the most labor intensive, probably the most emotionally intensive. So we want to make sure we're picking the right moments where we get the major benefits of it. All right. So when it comes to these conflict modes, I did a quick little overview of them. What's critical to remember is that there aren't good and bad conflict modes in this system, right? All 5 have a time and a place. And what's really important is that the effectiveness of that mode depends on the situation and depends on your skills. Now, this is in contrast to oftentimes what poor conflict conductors will do is they'll pick the style they're most comfortable with rather than the one that fits the scenario. So that's the really key takeaway. You need to get good at all 5 of these modes, because you're going to run into scenarios that require one or maybe a switch from one to another. And if you constantly are accommodating, or you're constantly avoiding, or you're always competing, what you're doing is picking a mode based on your preferences and your skills, and you're not picking it based on the situation. We want to flip our thinking there. Another thing to note, I don't have enough time to go into all the details of this, but it's really critical to note, there's a lot of factors that go into your personal conflict preferences. So if you're not great at certain styles, it's okay, right? There's many things that go into that. Lots of research shows that gender, age, socioeconomic background, work history, all of these things have an effect on what styles you tend towards. What's really important is to take a step back, look at why you tend towards certain styles, and start to look for opportunities to practice the other styles in lower stakes scenarios so you gain a little confidence. If you're really interested in this topic, there are a variety of Thomas-Kilmann conflict assessments online that you can do. Some cost a little bit of money, take a little bit of time, but they'll give you an understanding of what your preferences are and how you can work on developing some of the other muscles with some of these other styles. Now, with these modes of conflict, what's really important is to think about how do we gather the right information so we can pick the right conflict mode, right? So the best way to do that is through these conflict assessment questions. What these questions will do are essentially help you understand what are the facts of the situation, and then with this evidence, how can I lead myself towards a particular style that suits the facts and not necessarily my personal preferences. So big question, how do I know which style to use? The answer is you use the answers, the evidence you gather by reflecting on the conflict to guide yourself to the right style. So really important here, the evidence you gather through these questions is much more important than the personal preferences. If you just choose your personal preference, most likely it's not going to be the right one to solve that conflict most efficiently and most effectively. It's going to be the one that maybe you feel most comfortable starting with, but it won't be most effective. So some questions you want to ask yourself that'll lead you towards the right approach. How much stress is involved in this conflict? Is this easy, right? Are people not really caring so much, or are people really, is this a lot of anxiety around this, right? How complex is this conflict? Is it something we can hash out in 30 minutes on a Zoom call? Or is it something that's going to take a lot of stakeholders weighing in? Is it going to take a lot of time to do some research, to understand different perspectives? How much time will it take to break this down? How important is this topic to both people? Does it matter a lot more to me than to the other person? Maybe this is a situation where I can accommodate because I don't really care and they care a whole lot. So politically, it might be a good moment for me to kind of give them a win. So when something matters more to me down the line, I can actually stand up for myself and I'll have created a little bit of social credit. How much time do we have to address this conflict? Is one of the people or both people overwhelmed with other work, and there's not enough time to hash something out with a collaborative approach. Maybe we need to compromise to save a little time. Other questions: how much do I trust this person? And along the lines of trust, how good are both of our communication skills so we don't get defensive and we don't start to see our tempers rise, right? This can allow us to pick a choice, to choose a style that will maybe play up to our strengths, or potentially avoid a conflict with someone who you know will start getting defensive and start getting really heated. Thinking systematically, right? Within an organization or within a system, how much are those norms encouraging people to be open, and how much do I trust the information they're giving me, or am I worried that they're going to obfuscate, maybe not give me a real clear answer? I can't go into a collaborative conflict process with someone that I don't trust, and I don't trust the information they're giving me. That may be a situation where we need to compete, because either way, there's not going to be a level of kind of goodwill. And finally, how critical is this relationship, right? Is this someone you work with all the time? Maybe worth spending the time to really dig into their needs? Or is this maybe a vendor or a consultant, right? Not to just trash on consultants, that's me. Is this someone you're probably never gonna work with again? So the relationship doesn't really matter. So you can maybe push the gas pedal a little bit and maybe compete a little bit more than accommodate, right? Thinking critically and thinking strategically in that way. Based on these answers, and there's a lot more analysis that you can go into, the evidence here will lead you towards a style. And again, this style should be based on the evidence you gather through questions and reflection, rather than saying, I'm just kind of a conflict avoider, I'm not going to deal with this. That's not how you get better, right? That's how you just play towards your existing strengths, and you will not get better at conducting conflict. And we're going to get to how that's going to really set you back if you're conducting conflict remotely in some of the later sessions here. So I'm talking a lot about collaborative conflict as this gold standard. Let me talk about what that looks like in a little bit more detail, because I think it's really important for us to pay attention to all of the steps required to really collaborate on a conflict and do a good job, not just pay lip service to it. So when it comes to collaborative conflict, it's a 5-step process. So some of the reasons why you may want to go down this process are questions you want to ask yourself to see, is it going to be worth the effort, right? You can't do this every time. You'll run out of steam. So collaborative conflict, lots of research shows it has the longest lasting and the most effective solutions when people go through this process in an organization. Why is that? It promotes a bunch of really positive aspects. Part of collaborative conflict is creating an environment of psychological safety. That's step one. And I'm going to talk about these steps in a moment. When you create that environment of psychological safety lasts and is something you can build upon. So it doesn't tear it down. It actually establishes a platform that makes it easier for people to share in the future once you've done these building block steps. It's also really helpful for merging different people's perspectives. So much of collaborative conflict involves active listening and reflecting. So you're going to learn a lot about where people are coming from. That's built into the process. That merging of perspectives, it's what's going to lead to creativity. So you're going to come up with new ideas that didn't exist prior to the 2 or 3 or 4 of you getting together in a room and going through this process. Critically, what you're doing in collaborative conflict is basically what's called reframing. You're shifting the mindset of this problem from me battling you, shifting from us being adversaries, to instead us working together to solve the problem, right? Instead of me versus you, we're shifting from us versus a shared problem we both agree needs solving. And if you can make that pivot in a conflict, you are going to be so much more likely to succeed and create a scenario where you're generating new, creative, useful ideas that actually solve a problem, rather than just papering over an issue and maybe just temporarily solving something. You're going to really need to shift that mindset. Once you do that mindset shift, the rest of this process is actually pretty easy. It's getting to that flip that takes a lot of the upfront work. When you go through all of this work, you build trust and respect. there's so much listening and acknowledging and empathizing that has to happen, that all of that is good work that's always useful to do with colleagues that you care about and you're going to work with. So counterintuitively, going through a conflict in this way actually builds your relationship and makes it easier for you to solve problems in the future, because it's building a foundation of trust, good communication, listening, and empathy that will serve you so much as you keep moving forward in your working relationship with this person or with this group. So all of this is a great, useful exercise to help you learn and grow as a leader, as a manager, as a coworker, just as a partner, as a person. Super useful. I'm really passionate about this because it's important stuff. So the process is relatively simple. And if we had more time, again, this is a teaser for you to sign up for a full workshop, I give you tools that you can use at each step of this process. But basically, the collaborative conflict process starts with an invitation to dialogue, right? Creating a safe environment away from kind of back and forth catfighting into a new scenario where safety can be established, where people can be open and honest with each other. We'll talk about how that safety can be achieved and also what you can do if that safety isn't happening through a little bit of a tool there for dialogue. But once that safety is established, then you need to do three things. You need to listen to each other, right? Actively listen and reflect back what you're hearing. We've talked about that in previous webinars. Asking great questions, asking the right type of questions, asking open questions that don't imply you know the answer or don't lead people down a certain path. True questions that are inviting them to disclose in a safe way. And then with that information, both parties work to reframe the situation to, again, make that pivot from me fighting you to us together, now that we've learned a little bit more about each other's perspectives, us together agreeing that there's a shared problem that's redefined and reframed that we both can work together to solve. Once you've reframed that problem, then things get fun, right? Then you actually get to use that collaborative instinct to merge perspectives, generate new ideas, and come up with a lot of potential solutions by bouncing ideas off of each other. Again, a lot of yes and style brainstorming, a lot of creative ways that you can go about this problem, this solution generation process. Then you pick a solution and you decide, how are we going to measure progress, right? Are we going to come back together in a month, in 6 months? What are our KPIs? How are we going to know this is working? Come to an agreement on that. Maybe this is a moment you bring in other stakeholders to weigh in on how to measure success. And then you actually have to follow up, right? This is what makes it so time consuming, is that you have to come back a month, 6 months, a year later and see how well you did. And critically, this is a process that is iterative. So if you didn't quite get it right or things are still wrong, you re-engage in this process. You have another conversation, you understand what's still broken and generate new ideas to make sure you get it right and get it right in a sustainable way. You may have to go through this process 2, 3, 4, 5 times. That's why this takes a while. This isn't something you can do on a Friday afternoon and be done with it by the time it's time for happy hour, right? It's going to take a while, but it's also all good work to do with people you trust and people you have to work with, because this continues to build, and every time you go through it, you get better. So the first time is hard. Second time is a little easier. As you get better at creating safety, sharing, and reframing, this process goes faster and faster. So again, I'm moving pretty quickly here, and I'm seeing some questions, which I'm excited to answer in a moment. I have about 7 more minutes where I want to get into, now that we've talked about conflict at a really high level, looking at some ways to be strategic about analyzing a scenario, picking a style, and then going through some of the work to truly listen and collaborate. Now I want to get into some of the bad news, which is this all gets a lot more difficult when we are at home and can't do this in person. So I want to look at some of the research around why remote conflict is so difficult. What are some of the interpersonal challenges? What are some of the communication challenges? And what can we do as leaders to ease some of the burden when it comes to solving conflicts remotely? I'll spoil the ending here. it doesn't get easier to do this remotely, but there are simple pitfalls we can avoid to at least make it so that worst case scenarios don't arise, and we have some strategies when these problems do pop up. So remote conflict, what are some of the unique challenges that remote work presents when it comes to resolving conflict? Let's go through a couple of these. So one of the main ones is this idea of insecurity. And I already noticed in the chat box earlier on, some people talking about this idea of insecurity and not necessarily knowing what other people are working on. And it creates this loop, this almost cycling effect in someone's brain where they can't see someone to challenge some of their assumptions that maybe a team member isn't pulling their weight. It starts to create the baseline for real conflict. So there's a study, and I'll post the link to this study in the chat, where remote workers are a lot more likely to feel like their colleagues don't have their back. Specifically, what that looks like is they feel like colleagues are less likely to fight for them, for their priorities. They're more likely to talk behind their backs, right? Because they can't see anyone, and they're worried people are going to text their colleagues or chat them privately. More likely to make changes without warning people, without alerting them virtually. And also, what that can look like is a lot of sources of remote conflict look like misaligned goals, priorities, and expectations because of these fears that people have listed. Another source of conflict that comes up a lot with remote teams is that this idea that other people aren't working hard enough, they're not pulling their weight. Again, we've talked about this as a trust issue way earlier on in these Work From Home Wednesdays. Is trust and assuming good intent is something that has to be established early on. Otherwise, these small fights can bubble up. Lack of communication, black holes, people not responding to messages in enough time and not setting expectations on how responses should be coming. And simply put, just not knowing your place on the team. Specifically, when I talked about the change curve in a previous webinar, that depths of depression can often look like where you don't know how you are participating and how you're expected to add value to a team. So when you find someone really struggling and just struggling to keep their head above water and contribute, that can have an outlet in fights and conflicts because of their own insecurities about their role on a team, which is probably totally founded since we're seeing a lot of layoffs, a lot of furloughs, a lot of people losing their roles, losing their jobs. So it's not unfounded, a lot of these things too. But it becomes a lot worse when they can't get these assumptions checked with a quick in-person conversation. So there's some great sources on this. Athena's going to put those in the chat where you can keep reading about where some of these insecurities come from. And I'm sure a lot of us on this call have felt some of these insecurities because, again, we quite literally can't reach out and touch our coworkers. So we can't check some of the fears and voices in our heads that are telling us that we're not mattering as much or that our colleagues aren't caring for us. So another thing I think is really important to look at is this term. It's called online disinhibition. And this is a phrase, this is a term that I think is really important for us to understand when it comes to working completely online. So disinhibition is basically, it comes in two forms online. And what it means is it's a lowering of the guard, a lowering of sort of the rules of how we share emotions online. And typically, people feel like there are less guardrails and less rules for expressing themselves online. Now, we see this in many cases, especially right now, on social media. Let's say people feel a lot more comfortable really coming hard at someone or sharing things really explicitly or critiquing people really aggressively. Now, I'll say this, there's two forms. There's benign disinhibition, which actually works in our favor when it comes to conflict in an organization, because there are certain people who actually benefit from some of these online barriers, especially people who may struggle who in an in-person environment of speaking up, right? People who are more introverted, people who have some social difficulties. Some people feel a lot more comfortable sharing and expressing honestly how they're feeling online because there's a little bit of protection, right? It's just text, it's just voice. So maybe I don't feel as comfortable doing this in person in a 10-person meeting with my boss there, but I can feel really honest and open and comfortable critiquing a project direction when we're just having a conversation on Slack. That can actually be useful, right? This can be a situation where folks who struggle have a little bit of a leg up in our fully virtual environment. That's kind of good. However, there's a flip side to this. So every one of these things is individualized. Toxic disinhibition is the thing we'll see often with, social media, right? A lot of negative social behaviors can be increased or magnified or amplified because people feel protected. For example, someone could lash out at someone on Slack, say some personal, negative, really harsh, unfounded critiques. It's so easy to just type that really quickly, hit send, and not even think about the impact that those words, that text is having across the internet because you don't see the reaction. So that can cause some fights to spring up really easily because people feel more protected being hypercritical and hyperpersonal with their attacks when they're behind the wall of an online system, of a virtual conversation. So something I'm curious to hear about from you online right now, and again, don't be too disinhibited, I can't say it, disinhibited, so be nice. Where do you think you fall, right? Do you find that virtual communication helps you be more honest, or do you find you're kind of becoming maybe the target, or you notice your colleagues maybe being a little bit more on the toxic end of this spectrum where they're saying words that maybe they wouldn't say in person because it's a little too harsh? And so along the same line, the question there is, do you feel more protected or more exposed when you're expressing yourself online? This may be different for different online relationships you have, and maybe it's different for you personally. Maybe you feel comfortable sharing things on your personal social accounts and less comfortable, in your company Slack, maybe vice versa. I'm curious, feel free to chime in on the chat. And if you want to share with everyone, just make sure you select to all attendees, because I'm really curious. It's something maybe you don't have an answer right now, but worth reflecting on, how do these barriers help or hinder you, or maybe give you a little bit too much power, or a little bit make you feel a little bit more exposed to some attacks that maybe you're getting from your colleagues or from trusted people who behave differently online. That's essentially what this is about. And so the other thing that plays along with this is another term. It's called the empathy deficit. And the critical thing here is this happens online, where you probably have noticed this, right? But we're just putting a scientific research term on it. It's this idea that we have a reduced ability to identify with the emotions of other people when we're engaging with them online, right? Kind of a no-brainer at this point, but it's good to remind ourselves why this is. And it's because we don't get nearly as much nonverbal feedback as we do when we're talking to someone face-to-face. So if you say something mean or tough, or maybe over the line to someone in person, you immediately get a visual, physical reaction from them, and you messed up. Because we know we're not going to get that, and because we're protected by, again, that previous term we're talking about, we don't get that immediate feedback. And we also don't understand that some of the emotions that people are sharing aren't even going to be easily expressed over text or over just voice chat. So all these factors contribute to this problem of empathy deficit, where we just don't have a sense of how our words are affecting people online, and it can cause a lot of unnecessary conflict. So I love this quote that I have here from Ed Musio, who wrote a great book called Make Work Great, and we'll post this article in the chat right now. He writes, "We're massively reliant on nonverbal cues to help us read people and interpret situations. Trust happens when people do what we expect. And when we're robbed of the information that helps us know what to expect, the result is a more detached and skeptical dynamic in which people feel a little less connected, a little less supported, and a little less sure they can rely on each other." And so I love the way he describes this: detached and skeptical, right? Which is a good way to describe a lot of what happens online. And you want to be really wary of creating a detached and skeptical dynamic within your team now that we're all, entering maybe month 3, month 4 of remote work. You're going to notice people stepping back, and that's partially due to this idea of an empathy deficit. So the final challenge I'll give you before I present some solutions and we bring this to a close and I'll answer questions is a final challenge is cultural differences. And basically, there's a lot of differences in cultural and specifically language norms that can lead to miscommunication. So some examples of that, it's already, there's different degrees of appropriate emotional expressiveness in person across cultures, across racial lines, across gender lines, across age lines. And that also has an online component where people feel different levels of appropriate levels of sharing emotions through text or through voice or through video chat. So an example of that is, you could just something as simple as someone texting you, "That's fine," versus "That's fine," right? Totally different tone. It's the same words, but in person, you would be able to read that the second one, "That's fine," is actually not fine. And you probably need to come to or ask a follow-up question to make it clear why it's not fine. Again, you can't necessarily read this, and it's not always appropriate to double check. And so shortness, conciseness, brevity, that can be an indication of a fight. It can also be an indication of a personal style. Again, this is a lot of complexity that you're going to have to sort out on an individual basis. Another issue online is the different degrees to which people are willing to speak up and contradict people, especially when you layer in power, right? Some people may feel a lot more comfortable doing it in person. Some people may feel a lot more comfortable doing it online. Video chat and phone add another degree of complexity. So again, with all of these challenges, the critical thing you need to be wary of is not aligning your preferences with other people's preferences and starting to play favorites and start to allow some of your own unconscious biases to bias yourself in favor or against people who share or don't share your same online communication styles and preferences. So put another way, there's a great quote from the CEO of Hubstaff, which is a company that works exclusively remotely, and they work to support remote companies. They don't, not exclusively remotely, but very heavily remotely. Dave writes, "If you catch yourself naturally relating better to someone from the same gender, background, communication style, or beliefs, make a conscious effort to reach out to the employees you're having a harder time relating to. They'll notice and appreciate the effort, as long as it's genuine, and you'll be investing in their long-term satisfaction in working with you," right? Some people may prefer phone. Some people may prefer video. Some people may prefer chat. And just because you prefer or don't prefer their same communication method is not a reason to communicate more or more openly or more clearly or more frequently with that person or not with another person, right? This is a real challenge, especially if you have a diverse team, which is great. You're going to have a diverse set of communication preferences and behaviors that you're going to have to figure out on an individual level. How am I making sure to meet people where they are? All right, so what can we do? I've proposed a lot of problems with remote conflict. I have some ideas. And so some things you can do before a conflict starts. Just like Dave wrote in that quote, actively check in to strengthen personal relationships, right? Have conversations with people that are about the person, not necessarily about just a project. In those conversations, reminding each other about common interests, common experiences, projects you've worked on together. You can tie this back to team values. You can compliment people on remote working behaviors that you really appreciate and are making your life better. Because again, people don't see the impact nearly as much of the good work and the care they're taking for other people when we're remote. So you want to give people some of that credit, right? So this is important to do this before a fight starts, right? So people assume good intent, right? We're all tying it back to that values conversation we had in the earlier webinar. Having check-ins at the beginnings of meetings where people can share how they're feeling, right? Me personally, things have been tough over this last week, right? But you wouldn't necessarily know unless you asked, right? So you need to give people an outlet so you can start to parse the difference between the "that's fine" and then "that's fine," right? And give people a little bit of extra slack because we're working in a really stressful time right now. Things are only getting more stressful. Using reflection, we talked about this ability. Share back what you think you heard to make sure you heard it right, right? So give them an opportunity. If you think you misheard them or don't understand the tone, give them a chance to correct you instead of assuming. Again, a lot of this takes a little extra time, but you're going to really head off miscommunications, which are much more likely, especially if miscommunications about tone. If you share back, hey, I'm hearing a little bit of a difference in tone today. I want to make sure that that's fine, you just said, truly means you're on board. If not, let me know what I'm missing, right? Things like that. So you're correcting assumptions. Asking clarifying questions to make sure you understand what they mean. And if they're disagreeing, make sure you understand why they're disagreeing. And everything comes back to team remote working agreements. We talked about this in that values conversation, but making sure that you have a set of norms that people can use to refer to if people aren't living up to those standards, right? Make it clear how people should talk. A code of conduct for Slack, right? A code of conduct for what we're doing in virtual meetings to make sure we're hearing from people. That way, if people aren't living up to that, you can provide feedback that's based on observable facts and behaviors rather than feelings and emotions and observations coming from a personal point of view, which can easily turn into a back and forth, they said, where it's not actually going to be useful and we can't correct a behavior because you can never provide feedback on people's opinions. It's just going to lead you down a very useless street. So referring back to our values, our team agreements, what we expect of each other, so the feedback can be clear and we can nip things in the bud. Another thing that's really important, and it goes along this idea of adding structure to everything we're doing virtually. Everything takes more planning and takes more rules and frameworks. Build in situations where people are forced to disagree earlier on in a project. Add that into meeting agendas. That way people, especially people who are a little more nervous conducting conflict, especially nervous conducting conflict online, can put on that hat of the devil's advocate and have a little bit of cover for arguing or disagreeing. That way they don't feel as exposed, right? This gives people who, for various cultural reasons, background reasons, history reasons, don't feel as comfortable disagreeing and don't necessarily have the tools. They can play a role, and that gives them a little bit more support. It also does it early on, so you don't come to the end of a project and realize no one agreed with you, and that can lead to a really, really bad fight. So adding these roles like a devil's advocate that destigmatize disagreement and allow people to practice disagreeing in a more open way helps build that muscle, not only in yourself, but in your team. Finally, what can you do if things already start boiling over? Pick up the phone. Do not conduct conflict over email. That is, if there's one thing you take away from this workshop, it's don't go back and forth on a 20, 30, 40, 50 back and forth email chain. Pick up the phone, schedule a video chat. Hopefully those norms are becoming a little more normal for you. Email is a problem for a couple reasons. One, there's a record of all the nasty stuff you and the other person said that anyone can print out and bring back to you. It's just don't want to put that in writing, especially if you're heated, right? So if you're pissed, put away the keyboard, pick up the phone. That way you're going to get a lot more of those nonverbals and tone. Makes it a whole lot easier for you to understand why someone's feeling. And also, once you've resolved that conflict, it's really important that you have a conversation and a debrief about what happened. Because what can be really useful is once things are a little bit more calmed down, review what happened. Get to the source of how it got to this bad place. Understand how this is a sort of a result of people's communication styles or miscommunication styles. And then if you really have a strong team dynamic, share it with the team. Use it as a case study. If the two people who are in that conflict are comfortable, use them as an example. And that's actually a really powerful way, again, going back to the storytelling module, to show rather than tell what we can do differently to avoid conflicts in the future, right? It's one thing to say, like, we do not use harsh language on email. It's another thing to have the two people who just had a horrible email exchange express what happened from their point of view and show the team how they can do it differently. People will remember that and will really have a behavior change. If you just talk about it in abstract ways, not as useful. And again, circle everything back to the team charter. What did we learn from this experience? How can we clarify the behavioral expectations we have of each other that we've all agreed to, so that as a group, we can learn when there's a flare-up? That makes it productive rather than something that you just want to forget about and bury in the closet and never talk about again. It can become a really meaningful moment in a team's history to grow and get better. And finally, the last thing I'll leave you with as a skill for you as a leader is it's important for you to observe your shifts in people's communication style. So you want to be really aware of subtle shifts in how your employees are talking with you and talking with each other, because that's indicating that a conflict could be coming. So the kinds of shifts that may indicate a conflict is coming is, people reducing the amount of expressiveness that they typically use, right? This is an exclamation point person or an emoji person, they're always putting in the fun stuff on Slack. If you're starting to notice they're kind of giving one word or flat responses and not using the kind of bubbliness or expressiveness previously, that's a good moment to have a one-on-one video chat and check in, right? Don't have to have much of an agenda other than how are you doing? What's going on? I'm noticing, and again, you can observe behavior rather than make a guess. I'm noticing a shift in your communication style. Tell me what's going on. Another thing is if they're differing how they deal with certain people rather than changing their entire tone or an entire communication process. So you're noticing them being short or clipped with certain people in your team meeting and not others. That may mean that there's something going on between a person or a couple people that maybe you're not seeing because it's happening in one-on-one chat conversations or in an email exchange that you can't see. And simply disengaging, right? If someone is disengaging from group threads or chat channels, you're not hearing from them in meetings, this is a thing that is a red flag that means that this person is ripe for lashing out potentially, or something is going on. Maybe they've been the victim or they're on the receiving end of some of the emotional deficit or empathy deficit of others. So you want to use that as an opportunity to observe something, ask about it, and talk to that person. And finally, a really aggressive version is just kind of excluding people from group discussions, isolating people, which is really difficult when we're remote, because if you're isolated, you are fully isolated, right? You have no idea what's happening. And if you feel excluded, that can cause a situation where you start to feel like it's time to lash out. So all things that are worth calling out, nipping it in the bud, and using this as a way to measure, is a fight about to start somewhere that I don't know. So a question for the chat as we go into our question and answer is, what other virtual communication behaviors have you observed that are the indicators that a fight is about to start, or that a fight is already happening that maybe you missed, right? And you're not seeing because it's happening digitally in an area that you don't have visibility into. There's probably a lot of stuff, like more specific things. So I'm curious if people want to share that in the chat or just kind of reflect on what some of these shifts are for your individuals or your teams. All right. So that's it for the content. So quickly to recap before we get into question and answer. And if you do have questions, now's your chance to type them into the question and answer box. We talked about the modes of conflict, Thomas-Kilmann modes. We talked about objectively assessing a conflict to choose what fits the situation rather than what fits your personal preferences. We talked about what collaborative conflict looks like and how difficult it can be, but how useful it is, the benefits of it. And we talked about why remote conflict is so hard, what you can do to reduce the likelihood that your team will fight, and what you can do once it's already started to help kind of calm things down and resolve it, hopefully using one of the effective approaches we talked about. So I'm going to actually stop my share and I'm going to see what we have for questions. So we've got a question here from Franz. So with complexity, what are suitable strategies to deal with large-scale conflicts, i.e. the number of involved parties is much larger than 2? Okay, so this is a great question from Franz. With a complex conflict with a lot of parties, it's important to think about what are my relationships with all of these various parties, right? So you may have some allies in the mix. You may have some enemies, let's say, in the mix, and you'll probably have a lot of people kind of in between. The first thing you want to think about is is this group going to have the ability to communicate openly and honestly? Is there a nice level of trust? And it may be that there's a much higher level of trust with certain people. I would say start there and start to think about where are the overlapping areas where you agree. Because the whole point of this is to think about, if we're going down the collaborative approach, how can we reframe? So you may want to test out reframing with some of the people that you are trusting and have a good relationship with and can communicate openly with. And then if you do that work with them first, that reframed conflict, again, the us versus the problem rather than us versus each other, it'll be a lot easier to go to the groups that you don't have as good of a relationship with and say, hey, we've talked. We think this is maybe another way to approach it. And you'll have both some people to back you up, and also you'll have a better starting point because you've kind of picked and chosen some of the people that you work better with. And then trying to have those conversations individually so you don't get to that groupthink situation where it's a bunch of people all resisting for various reasons. Have those one-on-one conversations first before you bring them all together. So a couple of answers there. Great question. I think it's hard because most conflicts involve a lot of various parties. So that looks like it in terms of questions. I'm going to reshare my screen right now and say this. As always, please reach out to me if you have further questions. We're going to put this link in the chat box for you to just directly schedule some time on my calendar to talk about some of these challenges. I'm offering 30-minute free consultations to talk about remote conflict, talk about remote culture, remote working situations, and or even remote public speaking, engaging virtual audiences. So this is kind of my offer to you to keep this conversation going. And I'll say this is the end of what I'm going to call season 1 of Work From Home Wednesdays. We're going to be putting this on pause for now as we think about, what's this next phase, this next stage of working from home? What do people want? What do they need? I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of webinars out there. So I'm taking a step back from webinars to think about how can I continue to serve you, this audience, most effectively. We're going to be rebroadcasting a lot of these webinars because there's 10 webinars on really important remote work information. So it's all available for you to use. There's kind of a library. That's that season 1 that you can now binge on demand. But please reach out because I'm now in a phase where I'm trying to learn what's next. I want to hear from you, the listener, the audience. What are your challenges as you're thinking about returning to the office, as you're thinking about promoting collaboration while we're still working virtually, like we talked about in the previous Work From Home Wednesday. So please reach out. I want to have conversations. I want to learn. And I want to start developing new content. So with that, I'm going to sign off. I want to thank everyone for being such a great audience over these past couple months. This isn't the end. So stay tuned for more information. I've got your email, so you'll hear from me. Otherwise, good luck with your working from home. Good luck with your remote conflicts. And don't be a stranger. Reach out. Let's talk. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk soon.